I live in a dry valley area in northern Washington. There are not a lot of trees where I live. It's in the middle of nowhere. It takes 45 minutes to get to the nearest Walmart. About twice a month, we take a long drive to the superstore to do our big shopping. It's a beautiful drive, lots of hills and rocky walls and windmills. There is one stretch of road that is covered in big trees, and off to the side of the road is a drop off where a little lake sits surrounded by scattered trees, shrubs, and boulders. The water is very dark. To me, it seems unusually dark, and every time we've passed, the water always looks still, never moving. Something about it gives me the chills. I don't want to brag, but I'm very sensitive to supernatural and spiritual places and situations. Even though I'm no longer a Celt and have since, in the last 4 years, become a Christian, I do believe the Fae are real and are connected to the earth. Anyways, as we were driving by the dark lake one day, I saw something swimming in the water. Now, there are no fish in this little lake as far as I've been told, and the distance we were from the lake meant that whatever was out there had to be something big. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to see it. I asked my husband to pull over so we could check it out. We got out of the car and climbed down the rocky roadside through the shrubs and past a few tall and creepy trees. When we reached the lake, the water was once again quiet and still. It was dark and eerie and looked like glass. We stood there for a few minutes and waited, but nothing happened. It seemed like whatever I had seen wasn't going to surface again. My husband is also a Pentecostal Christian, and as such, we all believe in the spirit world. But he wasn't as aware of things like this as I was, so he grew impatient pretty quickly and suggested we head back. We started back toward the car. He was a few paces away from me, almost at the car, when I heard my phone ring. The phone sounded far away. Now, I could have sworn I left the phone in the glove box. In this specific area, we don't get service, so I thought it was weird that my phone was even ringing. I looked everywhere in the car and couldn't find it. The only logical thing was to go back down to the lake and look for it. As I headed back toward the lake, I spotted the little light on my phone gleaming as it rang. My husband offered to run down and get it, but I really wanted to go take a second look down at the lake. I climbed back down the rocky hill to the side of the lake where my phone was lying. I had a really weird feeling. I was 95% sure I had left my phone in the car. I remember thinking it was a brand new phone, and I didn't have a case for it, so I didn't want to accidentally drop it on a rock or in the water or something. I could have sworn I had put it in the glove box for safekeeping. But there it was, on the sand, next to the dark lake. As soon as I picked up my phone, it stopped ringing. I checked the screen to see who was calling, but it was some strange number I'd never seen before. I tried to call it back, but I kept getting a no service signal. As I stood up, I looked once more at the lake, and in that moment, for a split second, I saw the creepiest face in the water. From what I could tell, it was a woman with glowing eyes and black hair floating on the water. All I saw was her hair and her eyes, though. Then I started to hear strange whispers, I couldn't make out what the whispers were saying, but I listened intently. And that's when I noticed how silent everything was, apart from the whispering. There weren't any bird sounds or wind sounds or waves on the water. It was like I was in some kind of sound free bubble. Then, not far from the edge of the lake, this dark greenish figure began to lift its face out of the water. It was a woman. It smiled at me with a mouthful of sharp green teeth. I wanted to run immediately, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She seemed to be trying to get me to come into the water. I could see her fingers signaling for me, and I heard a weird voice say something like, "Come swimming with me. I've missed you. Don't you remember we used to be friends?" I felt myself take a couple of steps towards the water, even though that was the last thing I wanted to do. But then I stumbled over a rock, and it was like I had snapped out of a trance. I jerked around and bolted back up to the car as fast as I could. Then I jumped into the car and told my husband to drive. Just drive. He could tell how terrified I was and slammed on the gas. As we were speeding back up the highway, I sat there in silence. I didn't tell my husband what had just happened. I didn't want to. I felt like I couldn't tell him, like I couldn't tell anyone. And he seemed to get that and didn't press me. Now, years later, I'm able to write the story down, even if I still can't talk about it out loud. I hope forcing myself to share this story will help someone else avoid what I think could have been a terrible fate. The truth is, I'm still haunted by it. And I know for the rest of my life, I will never be rid of the image of that sinister smile. My encounter with the fair folk happened when I was around 10 years old. At that age, I was more of an atheist than anything. To me, fairies were creatures that were kind and good, but they were still imaginary. So, anyway, one night as I was lying in bed, I heard this wailing noise. That's the best way to describe it. The only way, really. I shot bolt upright and looked around my bedroom. There was a woman standing in my bedroom doorway. Her hair was pure white, but her skin seemed to be darker than the shadows surrounding her. She looked as though she had been swimming, but I know that was impossible since there were no pools anywhere nearby. I screamed, and then she screamed, and then drew back and vanished. My parents spent the better part of the night consoling me and convincing me that the lady wasn't real. I'm 21 now, and I haven't seen the woman since. But that one incident affected me so much that I never again slept without a light on. Last year, we moved to this house that's smaller. The bedrooms are closer together, which means if a light is turned on, everyone can see it. So I've had to try to get used to sleeping in the dark again, even though I haven't done it since age 10. But these nights, sometimes when the lights are off, I smell the scent of salt water, even though my house is nowhere near the sea. I keep my eyes closed. I don't open them and I don't look at the doorway. I've heard enough stories about fairies to know that seeing them isn't a good thing. Hi, my name's Brooke, and I'm currently 25. One day, about 4 years ago, I was telling my sister about this strange dream I'd had. I don't remember the dream that well, only pieces of it, but it spooked me, so I wanted to share. In the dream, I was about to be taken by something. Whatever this thing was, it had me in its clutches. Then all of a sudden, my cousin appeared and jumped on this thing. He was swinging a bat, I think. That's as far as I got into telling my sister about the dream when she interrupted me and said that what I thought had been a dream had actually happened. I didn't believe her at first, but then she told me a story about an incident that happened when I was 3 years old. My dad had taken my sister, who was 7 at the time, and 3-year-old me to visit our aunt and cousins in the country. During the ride over, I had fallen asleep. My auntie's house was at the end of a long driveway. The house was 2 stories, and the second floor had a huge window that overlooked the front yard. Since the day was cool and I was sleeping so soundly, my dad left me in the car while he brought a few things inside. My sister found my cousins and they were running in and out of the house as kids do. At one point, they ran up the stairs to the second floor and then toward the huge window at the front of the house. As they passed the window, they stopped. They had a clear view of the driveway and the car where I still lay asleep. They saw a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes floating in the air next to the car. It drifted towards the door and then leaned over and looked through the car window at me. My sister and cousins started screaming and shouting, "The Taniwha! It's gonna take Brooke!" My sister said she had no idea how she knew this thing was called the Taniwha. In fact, she had never heard of the Taniwha before. She just started shouting its name. My dad and our other cousin, age 11 at the time, rushed out the front door toward the car. My cousin, who had grabbed a cricket bat on his way out, jumped on top of the car and started swinging the bat in the air as if he too could see the shadowy figure. And he was able to chase the thing off. As my sister told this story, I started to have broken memories of the incident. I remembered a cold feeling, as if something was holding my arms. Whatever that thing was, it did have me. The whole car had felt like a cold embrace. Then the thing rushed off, and the cold feeling went with it. Later, when my sister and I once again visited my aunt and cousins, we decided to ask my cousin about the incident and if he could remember what had happened. He said he did remember and told a story that was almost identical to my sister's. So, you've mentioned the Taniwha in a previous video as a type of water fairy in New Zealand lore? This aunt we were visiting had a creek that ran behind this house. The kids and I loved to go play around there. I'm just thinking now, did this thing live in the creek behind my aunt's house? Did it want to kidnap me and drag me into the water? I haven't done too much research on the Taniwha, so I actually don't know much about this being. I'm not sure I want to know, honestly. Even thinking about it gives me the chills. There were a few other disturbing incidents in my childhood where I thought something was trying to take me. And I do wonder if it was the Taniwha, if she gets fixated on one target in particular, and if she'll keep coming after me until she succeeds. I'm a practicing witch in my early 20s from Germany. Up until now, I was rather unsure and too timid to share my stories with you, but a friend encouraged me to do so. This will probably not be the last time I will share a story of mine. Around 2020 to 2021, I was unemployed due to my mental health and the ongoing pandemic. Last year, I learned a lot about witchcraft and folklore in general, and eventually started practicing. During this time, I was staying at my parents' house in a small village where I grew up. There's a forest nearby with hiking trails and a small river. During this year, a few strange incidents happened to me that I couldn't explain. But since they were fairly minor, I shrugged them off or blamed them on coincidence or chance. At the end of the year, I finally found myself a job and moved to a bigger town in Bavaria. The night before I moved, I found a single white moth-like wing lying on a table in the garden. I felt instinctively that it was some sort of gift, or maybe a message. Then, during my first night at my new home, I had a really strange dream, stranger than any dreams I've ever had. In the dream, I was back in the village I grew up in, hiking in the woods. It was pitch black, probably nighttime. I was walking toward the village. I knew this because there was this strange light coming from its location, and the closer I got to it, the more this weird light began to transform into a floating ball of fire. This was when I realized that I was actually dreaming, and the dream became sort of lucid. Now, I rarely have lucid dreams, despite being a witch and trying to practice it. I've never had much success. So this was unusual in itself, and I remember thinking that in the dream. Then, suddenly, I heard something coming from the river. I turned my head and saw a tall, feminine creature getting out of the water. Before I could react, it grabbed me. I was in shock. I froze. I couldn't move. I was still aware that I was dreaming, and yet I felt helpless, like the dream version of my muscles had stopped working. In silence, I watched her. I could barely see because of the darkness, but from what I could tell, she had dark green hair and large black eyes. She put her head closer to mine. I felt her wet, kind of wavy hair run over my face. She gently laid a wet hand on my cheek and stared into my eyes. She had a sickly, thin finger with long, sharp nails. I was disgusted and yet fascinated at the same time. This woman from the water then spoke in a telepathic way. It's hard to describe, but I somehow just knew what she was thinking. Her voice was calm, silky, and terrifying. "My dear child, come back to us. Come down to us, down to the water." She stroked my face as she said this. I was paralyzed, and yet I knew what was happening. I knew she was one of the fair folk, and that she was trying to lure me to her. Finally, I was able to move. I tried to push her away from me, and as soon as I did, she released me, turned, and fled back into the water. And instinctively, I knew that she couldn't have me unless I agreed to go with her. Then I woke up. The name Jenny Greenteeth was repeating in my head. Later, I did some research and found that a creature like one I saw exists in English, Irish, and German folklore, and has many names. Jenny Green Teeth, Ginny Green Tooth, Bandfionn, Water Woman, or like we call her here in Germany, Weisse Frau. She is a terrifying water fairy who likes to steal people and drag them into the water. That's who I think I met in my dream. Right now, as I'm writing this, I'm on vacation. I'm back at the village at my parents', not far from the forest, the hiking trails, and the river. I hope what I sensed in my dream is true. That Jenny Greenteeth can't have you unless you agree. Still, I never want to meet that creature again, in my dreams or anywhere else. So I've been avoiding the forest, the hiking trails, and especially the river. I guess it could have just been a dream, but I don't want to find out the hard way if it was something else. I used to fish a field. I fished it for over 30 years. It always felt like a very peaceful place, timeless. In hindsight, all the ingredients associated with fairies were there. The horses, the oak trees, the hawthorn bushes, the water, the little mounds of earth. And so it was. I was sitting out there on a still, moonlit night in summer. There were some other fishermen closer to the road on the other side. I could just hear their voices, but not their conversation. Bats were flitting around, and my mind was completely empty of all thought. A giant sponge, completely at ease with my surroundings. Then, out of nowhere, and clearly for me to hear, a voice said these words: "This one." I froze where I sat for a full half-minute before slowly turning around to survey the rest of the field. As expected, it was empty of all other humans, brightly lit by the moon overhead. I believe that I did catch a fish that night, but it had a deformation the like of which I had never seen. Puzzled by the significance of these two words, I returned to my lodgings in the city on Sunday evening. That night, I had a nightmare. The usual thing, a loud roaring sound getting louder and louder as it approached, like the sound of an advancing mob. All I knew was that I did not want to meet it. Then suddenly there was this ferocious yowling of a cat. It scared the hell out of me. And I woke up. I had an unsettled feeling that lasted the rest of the day. The following Friday, I returned to fish the field again. Later that night, as I lay in bed, there were strange tapping noises coming from the ceiling. Sometimes birds get in the attic above and normally roost when it gets dark. It struck me as a bit unusual, but I soon drifted off to sleep. I was tired after the late night of fishing. At 7 o'clock the following morning, I was awakened by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. It sounded like someone was mowing their lawn. But surely not at this time in the morning, I thought. Then I realized the sound was coming from inside, and more precisely from my kitchen. I hopped out of bed and went to investigate. There, on the side of the kitchen table, was my mom's battery-operated scourer, happily whirring away. The unusual thing about this was the button was so stiff on that scourer that I'd never been able to use it. Yet, where the rubberized button was, there was a big indent. More significantly, the scour was made by a certain well known soap brand and had the word fairy running the length of the handle. By now, I instinctively knew what was responsible. It all fitted. I felt like something had followed me home from the field. I remained calm. I would invite them to come back with me to their field, where we would hopefully part company after my fishing was over. And this I did. The fishing was uneventful but pleasant. In the field at that time were horses, which I had got to know down the years, and some bullocks and heifers. I had to traverse from one end of the field to the other to reach the road. As I neared the road in sight of the gate, I passed by a solitary bullock or heifer. We eyed each other, but it did not move. It struck me as strange that it stood there on its own and not with the herd, and there was something just off about it. But I dismissed it from my mind, advanced to the gate, and unshouldered my gear with my back to the gate. Suddenly there was a loud snort in my ear. I turned in surprise to see that it was the brown chestnut horse that I knew so well. I was a little surprised that I had not heard him approach. I climbed up the multi-barreled gate, and when I turned around to come down the other side, the horse was gone. Now, if it had just wandered off, I should have been able to see it. Just to determine that this was the case, I re-entered the field and walked back into it sufficient to have a panoramic view. But there was no horse, and there was no heifer anywhere to be seen either. Had the animals just disappeared? I sensed that I was being sported with somehow, but I didn't take it personally. I was pleased that the fairies were back in their home. And now it was time for me to do the same and return to my home, happy that we were each where we belonged. On Sunday morning, I was once more in my kitchen. What happened next I cannot explain in pure human terms, as it makes no sense. In terms of fairy powers, it makes perfect sense. And I attribute it to them. For no apparent reason, or telegraphed intent, I suddenly snapped my head around with a fairy-like speed. An entity stood behind me. It seemed surprised and then vanished, as if it had been caught off guard. Then, just for a fleeting second, I caught the scent of water-based rotting vegetation. To me, the strength of the scent indicated the strength of this being's powers, and it would be fully capable of turning on that scour. This was too much for me. I called upon all that I believe and went from room to room, asking whatever had followed me home to leave. At the end of the exercise, I was mentally exhausted, as if I had used up a lot of energy in doing so. But the atmosphere was perceptibly lighter, and my luck inexplicably became very good. After that, I should add that despite the strong smell, I never felt that whatever was in my home was evil, and I'm pretty sure I encountered it years later when fishing from the same field. On this particular night, as I fished, I smelled that exact same smell. It was unmistakable, and I sensed the being I had seen in my kitchen was back again, watching me. I suspect it to be a water spirit given the location. There's something about that field. I think it might be some kind of fairy stronghold or portal. I no longer visit that field to fish anymore, and yet I still feel the presence of the fairies now and again in my life through strange happenings. I don't need to go looking for them because they are never far away. I didn't choose them. They chose me, though I don't know why. They said it themselves. This one. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the subscribers who submitted their stories for this one. Let me know what you thought of these stories. Have you ever encountered anything like them? There's something about water fairies I've noticed. They're usually female, except for the Kelpies, and they tend to be the most aggressive, I suppose, of the fairies. Have you noticed the same thing? Let me know in the comments below and all your theories about the fairy world, as well as suggestions, questions, anything you'd like to talk about. I'll be there answering your comments for the next hour or so. If you have a story to share, you can check out my website at scaryfairygodmother.com, link in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, or suggestions. You can also sign up for my mailing list. It's free to sign up. If you do submit your story or have submitted it in the past and I haven't narrated it yet, that doesn't mean I won't. I'm really trying to get to them all, so please continue to submit your stories, and hopefully in good time you will hear your story narrated on this channel. As always, special thanks to all of my supporters on Patreon who are helping to keep this content going and hopefully expand in the future. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. You can also support me on Ko-fi. You can click the subscribe button. You can share this video, you can comment, you can like, all of those things help the channel, and you can also click the join button below this video. The stories in this video were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. Please leave a comment below, like, share, all that good stuff, subscribe if you're new, it really helps the channel, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.